There are nights when silence feels heavier than sound, when even breathing feels like too much effort. It was past midnight in a small Vermont town in the middle of January, the kind of cold that makes the windows whisper and the heart ache even more. Claire Thompson sat alone in her living room, a half-empty cup of tea on the table, her phone turned face down. On the screen were unread messages from her sister, her priest, and her therapist. She didn't want to answer anyone, not tonight. On the wall hung a photo of a young boy, her son Michael. He'd been gone for 3 years, and tonight was the anniversary of the accident. She whispered into the empty room, "God, if you're real, show me something, anything, because I can't do this anymore." Her voice cracked, echoing softly against the walls. Then, out of habit or despair, maybe both, she stepped outside. The snow was still falling. The sky above her was dark, cloudless, endless. And that's when she saw it. A light, soft at first, like a shimmer on water, began to glow above the tree line. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't a star. It grew brighter, taller, until its outline began to take form. A figure in white, a woman, hands folded in prayer. Claire's knees weakened, and for the first time in years, she felt something that wasn't fear. Before that night, Claire Thompson was invisible to most of the world. She had once been a middle school English teacher, gentle, patient, always the one who stayed late to help a struggling student. Her laughter used to fill classrooms. Her son used to call her the happiest woman alive. But grief is a thief that doesn't break in loudly. It comes quietly, piece by piece, until the person you were disappears. After the accident that took Michael's life, Claire quit her job. The classroom was too full of memories, the smell of chalk, the sound of laughter, the little handmade card he'd once left on her desk that said, "To the best mom in the world." She moved into a small cabin outside Brattleboro, surrounded by pine and snow, where no one asked questions. Her days blurred together, coffee, medication, silence. Her Bible gathered dust. Her rosary lay tangled in a drawer. Friends invited her to church. She never went. She said she didn't believe anymore, but the truth was worse. She still believed, but she thought God had stopped believing in her. Every night she would stand by the window, looking into the dark, hoping to feel something. Some sign that her son was at peace, some sign that she wasn't forgotten. And then came the night of the vision, when heaven would answer not with thunder, but with light. Grief doesn't strike like lightning. It seeps in, slow, invisible, until even the sunrise feels gray. For Claire, mornings were the hardest. That first breath after waking, when memory returns before the mind can brace itself. Her son's room still smelled faintly of laundry detergent and peppermint shampoo. The bed was neatly made, the baseball glove still on the shelf, as if he might walk back in and toss it to her with a grin. People told her time would heal, but time didn't heal. It only rearranged the pain. It turned sharp edges into dull aches that never quite went away. Her therapist called it complicated grief. Her priest called it a cross too heavy for one soul. And Claire called it silence. She stopped opening the curtains. The birds that used to sing outside her window went unnoticed. Even the sound of church bells on Sunday, once comforting, became a reminder of everything she'd lost. When friends visited, she smiled politely and said she was doing fine. But when they left, she would sit in the same armchair for hours, her mind replaying the accident, the screech of tires, the phone call, the sterile smell of the hospital room where she said goodbye. She told herself she didn't need faith anymore, that prayers hadn't saved her boy. But there were nights when she'd find herself whispering old words without thinking, "Hail Mary, full of grace." Then she would stop midway, ashamed of her own weakness. Winter came early that year. Vermont's skies turned steel blue, the trees stripped bare, snow falling in sheets like endless white noise. The world outside mirrored the emptiness inside her. One evening, she found an unopened Christmas card from her mother, sent the year before she died. Inside was a small medal, Our Lady of Sorrows. On the back, her mother had written, "For when life feels heavier than prayer." Claire held it tightly, tears stinging her eyes. She almost prayed again that night. Almost. But despair has a gravity of its own, and by mid-January she began to wonder if God had left her, or if she had left him. Until that night when the sky itself seemed to breathe. Until that light appeared. Until everything changed. Long before grief took everything from her, prayer had been part of Claire's rhythm, as natural as breathing. Her mother used to pray the rosary every night at the edge of her bed. Claire remembered the sound of those gentle murmurs, like waves on a shore, "Hail Mary, full of grace." As a child she used to roll her eyes at it, but secretly she loved the comfort in that voice, the steady faith of a woman who trusted heaven even when life was unfair. When her mother passed away, Claire inherited that same rosary, small, made of blue glass beads that caught the light like drops of morning dew. For years it hung by her bedside lamp, but after the accident it disappeared. She didn't throw it away. She simply stopped looking for it. Faith had turned into a memory too painful to touch. One afternoon, while cleaning a drawer she hadn't opened in months, she found it again, tangled among old photos and birthday cards. The beads were cold in her hand. One bead was cracked, the cross slightly rusted, but it was unmistakably her mother's. She stared at it for a long time. Then, out of nowhere, she heard herself whisper the first line she'd sworn she'd never say again. "Hail Mary, full of grace." The words caught in her throat. Her lips trembled. And suddenly she was weeping, not out of belief, not yet, but out of longing. It was the first time she'd cried like that since the funeral. And though she didn't know it, something unseen had already begun to shift. Because prayer, even when forgotten, doesn't die. It waits, like a seed buried under snow, waiting for the warmth to return. That night she placed the rosary on her nightstand. It was the first thing she saw when she woke up. And the last thing she looked at before she stepped outside, into a night that would change her forever. It was January 17th, the coldest night of the year. Claire had barely eaten that day. Her phone was off, her mind dull from exhaustion. For hours she sat in silence, staring at the rosary on the table, its beads glimmering faintly in the lamplight. Outside, the wind howled against the windows. Inside, her thoughts grew darker. She whispered, "God, if you're still there, please show me something, anything." Her voice broke on the word, "please." Then she stood up, almost without thinking, grabbed her coat, and stepped outside. The world was white and quiet, no sound but the soft hiss of falling snow. The pine trees stood like silent witnesses, her breath turned to fog in the frigid air. Above her, the sky was unusually clear. 1,000 stars glittered like shards of ice. And then a glow appeared. At first she thought it was the moon slipping through a cloud, but it wasn't. The light grew stronger, soft, golden, almost alive. It pulsed gently, as if breathing. Claire's eyes widened. Her knees trembled. The glow spread outward, forming a shape, tall, slender, radiant. And in that light she saw her. A woman draped in white and blue, hands clasped in prayer, a soft halo surrounding her face. No words, no movement, just presence. The light didn't blind. It embraced. It was warm, despite the bitter cold. Claire felt the air around her still, as if time itself had stopped to listen. Tears filled her eyes, spilling onto her frozen cheeks. She fell to her knees in the snow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The figure didn't speak. Yet Claire felt words form in her heart, not in sound but in meaning. "You were never alone. The wind calmed, the snow stopped, and for the first time in years, peace entered her chest, not a fleeting calm, but something deep, alive, eternal. A faint scent of roses lingered in the air, even though no flowers could survive the Vermont winter. Then, as gently as it had appeared, the light began to fade, not disappearing, but dissolving into the stars. Claire stayed there for a long time, her knees buried in the snow, her breath visible in the moonlight. When she finally stood, her tears had frozen on her face, but her heart was burning with warmth. At first, Claire thought she was imagining it, but the longer she looked, the clearer the figure became, floating above the tree line about 100 feet in the air, surrounded by a soft corona of golden light. The snow around her shimmered faintly, as if reflecting something not from this world. The light didn't flicker. It pulsed, steady and alive, like a heartbeat. Her breath caught. Her pulse slowed. It wasn't fear she felt. It was reverence. Somewhere down the road a dog began to bark, then another, and far off a window opened. A man's voice called out, "Claire, are you seeing this?" She turned. It was Tom Reynolds, her neighbor 2 houses down, a retired firefighter. He stood on his porch, staring upward, his cigarette forgotten in his hand. A few more lights flickered on across the frozen street. Curtains moved. People stepped outside into the bitter cold, drawn by the glow that now painted the snow in hues of gold and silver. For nearly 5 minutes, no one spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath. Above them the figure hovered, still, serene, timeless. The folds of her robe rippled as if moved by an invisible breeze. Her hands remained folded in prayer, and her head tilted slightly downward, toward the earth, toward them. Claire felt her heart breaking open, not from sorrow this time, but from a love so vast it terrified her. She didn't know how long she stood there, seconds, minutes, it didn't matter. All she knew was that something holy was happening, and she didn't want to blink. The light began to shift, slowly at first, then with a graceful motion like the turning of a page. The figure rose higher, her outline softening until it blended with the stars. And then she was gone, no sound, no trail, just a lingering shimmer in the air and a silence that felt sacred. Claire sank to the ground again. Her hands trembled, gripping the rosary she had slipped into her coat pocket earlier that night. Her lips moved in prayer, words she hadn't spoken in years. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners." Across the street, Tom whispered, "Did we all just see that?" Someone else said, "It's the Virgin Mary." Another voice, shaking, replied, "Then she came for a reason." The night sky returned to darkness, but no one went back inside right away, because for those who stood there, frozen, speechless, it wasn't the same sky anymore. Long after the light faded, Claire remained kneeling in the snow. Her knees were numb, her fingers stiff from the cold, but she didn't move. Something inside her had shifted. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was alive. Every sound, the faint rustle of trees, the crunch of distant footsteps felt part of a greater stillness that wrapped around her like a blanket. Her tears had frozen on her cheeks, but she was smiling, not with joy exactly, but with something deeper, a peace she couldn't name. For the first time since Michael's death, the weight on her chest was gone, not replaced by happiness, but by lightness. Like a door had opened somewhere inside her that she never knew existed. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Just those 2 words. Nothing more. When she stood up, the world looked different. The same trees, the same snow, the same silence, but everything felt awake. As she walked back to her cabin, she noticed small details, the glitter of frost on the mailbox, the moonlight turning the snow into silver dust, the faint scent of pine carried on the wind. For years, she had walked through life half alive. Now every breath felt sacred. Inside, she lit a candle, Its flame flickered gently beside the rosary on her table. The medal of Our Lady of Sorrows gleamed faintly in the light. She didn't try to explain what happened. She didn't need to. When she finally fell asleep, her dreams were calm. No flashing memories, no screams, no hospital corridors. Just quiet. And a soft blue light that seemed to stay with her, even when she woke. The next morning, the world outside her window sparkled under fresh snow. Birds were singing again. And for the first time in years, Claire opened the curtains wide and let the light in. Later, when her neighbor Tom stopped by, his eyes were red from crying. He said, "I don't know what we saw last night, Claire, but I haven't felt this kind of peace since my wife passed." Claire nodded, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Maybe," she said softly, "we weren't meant to understand it. Maybe we were just meant to remember." By sunrise, the story had already begun to move. In towns like Brattleboro, news travels faster than snowmelt. Tom Reynolds called the local sheriff first, not because he thought a crime had occurred, but because he couldn't explain what he'd seen. Within an hour, 2 deputies drove down Pine Ridge Road, their headlights cutting through the morning fog. They found footprints in the snow, dozens of them, leading out from the neighboring houses, all ending at the same open space behind Claire's cabin. By mid-morning, the local radio station mentioned it. Several residents reported seeing an unexplained light over Brattleboro around midnight. Witnesses describe it as a glowing figure resembling the Virgin Mary. Phones started ringing. Channel 4 from Burlington sent a small crew. A reporter named Megan Ellis arrived in a parka and boots, her microphone wrapped in plastic against the wind. She interviewed Claire, who stood shyly by her porch, cheeks pale, eyes tired, but peaceful. "I don't have answers," Claire said softly. "I only know what I saw and what I felt." Behind her, Tom nodded firmly. "It wasn't a reflection," he insisted. "You don't feel the Holy Spirit over a streetlight." The footage aired that evening, just a 2-minute segment before the weather report. Yet within hours, comments flooded the station's Facebook page. Some wrote, "Heaven sent us a sign." Others mocked it as snow glare or camera tricks. But even the skeptics admitted one thing. Every person who'd been outside that night spoke with the same quiet tone, as if they'd stepped out of something sacred. The next day, a small group gathered outside St. Agnes Church, lighting candles beneath the Virgin Mary statue near the entrance. Someone left a note that simply read, "We saw you." Father Donovan, the parish priest, later told his congregation, miracle or not, hearts were opened last night, and that alone is grace. The following Sunday, Claire did something she hadn't done in nearly 3 years. She went back to church. St. Agnes stood at the edge of town, a small brick church with a steeple that looked almost shy against the wide Vermont sky. She parked her old Subaru under a tree still covered in frost and sat for a long time, watching families walk in, mothers bundling their children in scarves, old couples holding hands, the choir director unlocking the side door. Her fingers trembled on the steering wheel. It felt strange, foreign, but when the bells began to ring, she took a deep breath and stepped out. Inside, the air smelled of incense and old wood. Candles flickered near the statue of the Virgin Mary, Our Lady of Sorrows, the same title that had been engraved on her mother's medal. Claire walked slowly down the aisle, her steps echoing softly. She felt the stares of people who hadn't seen her in years, but she didn't mind. Her eyes were fixed on the light near the altar. When the choir began to sing Ave Maria, her throat tightened. Tears welled up again, not from pain, but from recognition. She realized how much she had missed this sound, this peace, this sense of home. During communion, she knelt for the first time since Michael's death. Her lips moved in prayer, the same words she'd whispered in the snow. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." She didn't expect forgiveness, But somehow she felt it. After Mass, Father Donovan found her by the door. He didn't say anything, just placed his hand gently on her shoulder and smiled. That simple gesture undid her completely. She wept, not out of sorrow, but gratitude. When she walked outside, the sun had come out, melting the thin crust of snow on the church steps, and for the first time in years she lifted her face toward the light and smiled back. A week after the incident, the light over Brattleboro was still the talk of Vermont Public Radio. For every believer calling it a miracle, there was someone else trying to find a logical answer. So Channel 4 decided to do a follow-up. They interviewed a local meteorologist from the University of Vermont, Dr. Ethan Keller, a soft-spoken man with silver hair and a habit of folding his hands when he thought. He replayed footage taken from a security camera outside a gas station that night. The screen showed a faint luminous column over the tree line, expanding, then fading within minutes. Dr. Keller explained, "It could have been a rare case of light pillar phenomenon, ice crystals in the air reflecting a ground light source. The conditions were perfect for it: low temperature, high humidity, calm winds." But then he paused, tapping his pen against the desk. "Still," he admitted, "light pillars don't usually form distinct shapes, and they don't last that long, nor do they appear only in one specific spot." When the reporter asked if it might have been a hoax, he shook his head. "Not likely. We checked flight paths, satellites, even drone records. Nothing." Another expert suggested atmospheric plasma, but no scientific model explained the silhouette of a woman in white. Then the interview took an unexpected turn. Dr. Keller said quietly, "My wife was one of the people who saw it that night. She hasn't prayed in 20 years. But since that evening, she lights a candle every night before bed." The reporter looked surprised. He simply smiled. "Science studies what we can measure. But peace is harder to quantify." The segment aired on a Tuesday evening, ending with that final quote. Viewers across Vermont heard his words and fell silent. For some, it was proof of mystery. For others, it was proof of faith. And for Claire, watching from her small cabin, rosary in hand, it was simply confirmation of what she already knew. The world could try to explain the light, but only heaven could explain the peace. In the weeks that followed, something gentle began to stir in the small Vermont town. It wasn't dramatic. There were no processions, no crowds, no flashing headlines, just small changes, quiet ones, that only hearts could notice. At the local diner, a waitress said the regulars seemed kinder, tipping more generously. The owner of the hardware store found a handwritten note slipped under his door. "If you ever feel alone, look up. She's still there." At St. Agnes Church, attendance doubled. Some came out of curiosity, others out of longing. Many simply sat in silence, eyes closed, hands folded, tears falling without shame. Father Donovan said later, "It's like the whole town exhaled for the first time in years." Among the people most changed was Frank Mallory, a Vietnam veteran who'd lived 2 houses down from Claire. For decades, he'd battled nightmares, medication, and isolation. His daughter once said he hadn't slept through a single night in 15 years. But the morning after the apparition, Frank knocked on Claire's door. He looked different, calmer, his eyes clear. "I don't know what happened out there," he said, voice trembling, "but I slept all night. No dreams, no fear." Claire smiled, her own eyes misty. "Maybe peace doesn't come from forgetting," she said softly. "Maybe it comes from being found." In the months that followed, others shared stories like his. A woman battling addiction said she felt an urge to pray again. A teenager who had stopped talking to her parents suddenly asked to go back to church. Even the local paper ran a column titled, "The Night Our Town Found Peace." No one claimed to have all the answers. Some still called it coincidence, but everyone agreed something in Brattleboro had changed. And while the snow eventually melted and spring returned, the memory of that light stayed, Not in the sky, but in the quiet way people began to care for one another again. By summer, the snow was gone. The pines outside Claire's cabin were full again, and sunlight poured through the kitchen window each morning. Life hadn't become easy, but it had become meaningful. She still missed her son every day. She still cried sometimes when she heard his favorite song on the radio. But now, grief wasn't a prison. It was a doorway, a way to understand the pain of others. At the urging of Father Donovan, Claire began volunteering at a crisis helpline run by the local parish. The calls came from everywhere: single mothers, veterans, teenagers, widows, people who, like her, had reached the edge of hope. She didn't try to preach. She simply listened. Sometimes, in the middle of a trembling voice on the other end, she would close her eyes and whisper a silent prayer. "Mother Mary, be near them." One night, a woman called, sobbing uncontrollably. She said she'd lost her child and wanted to end her life. Claire's hands shook as she spoke into the phone. "I know that pain," she said quietly, "and I know what it feels like to think God's gone. But He's not. He's right there, in your tears, in your breath, in the next sunrise. Please, hold on." The line was silent for a moment, then the woman whispered, "Thank you." Afterward, Claire turned off the phone, placed her hand over her heart, and felt it beating steady and strong. Every day she kept a small candle burning beside the rosary her mother had left her. The flame never went out, not even during storms. She called it her light of mercy. People began visiting her cabin for quiet prayer. Some brought flowers, others came just to sit in silence. And sometimes, late at night, Claire would step outside, gaze at the stars, and smile softly. Because even if the vision never returned, she knew one thing for certain. She had been found, and now her purpose was to help others find the light too. Months passed, the snow melted, returned, and melted again. Life in Brattleboro slowly went back to its quiet rhythm, the school buses, the markets, the bells of St. Agnes ringing through the valley. But for those who had stood beneath that winter sky, something remained. It wasn't the image they remembered most. It was the peace. Claire often thought about that night, the glow above the trees, the silence, the warmth that shouldn't have existed in the freezing air. Sometimes she wondered if it had truly been the Virgin Mary, or if heaven had simply chosen that form to reach a broken heart. Either way, the message was the same: you were never alone. She carried that truth with her everywhere, in her prayers, in the quiet moments between phone calls, at the helpline, in the way she smiled at strangers now instead of looking away. One evening, as autumn settled in again, Claire drove to the overlook outside town, the same hill where she'd once knelt in despair. The sky was clear, thousands of stars flickering against the dark. She didn't ask for another sign. She didn't need one. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you for finding me in the dark." And then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, a soft beam of light appeared beyond the ridge. Not bright, not long. Just enough to remind her that miracles aren't always meant to be seen. Sometimes they're meant to be remembered. There are moments when heaven speaks, not in thunder, but in light. For Claire, it was a winter night in Vermont. For someone else, it might be a quiet prayer answered in the dark. If this story touched your heart, take a moment tonight to look up at the sky. Say a simple prayer. You never know what light might answer. Thank you for watching Ave Miracles, where real stories of faith remind us that God still moves among us. If you believe that the Virgin Mary still watches over her children, please subscribe, like, and share this story with someone who needs hope tonight. And remember, when you can't see the light, she still sees you.